heard my mother say Naomi's name before I heard anything else. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten every birthday breakfast, every holiday dinner, every quiet Saturday morning of my entire life, and she said it like I wasn't even in the room, like I was furniture, like I was already gone. Naomi will take over the workshop. Her voice was steady, measured. Practiced, I realized. She had rehearsed this. I turned my face toward where I knew she was standing. I couldn't see her anymore, but I could feel the temperature of the room drop when she spoke. My father said nothing. He never said nothing unless he agreed completely. "I'm right here," I said. My voice was quieter than I intended. "I can hear you, Elise." Dad's voice had that particular weight, the one that meant the decision was already made, had been made days ago in some other room I wasn't invited into. "This is about what's best for the family. For the family. Not for me. Never for me." I pressed my palms flat against the table. Cool wood beneath my fingers. The workshop had been my grandfather's soul. He had pressed my hands against these same kinds of surfaces and told me I had the gift. He had meant me. Both of us, but he had especially meant me. And now they were giving it away. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply sat there and decided that they had made the last decision about my life they would ever make. Hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Before the story continues, take a second to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Here we share true-to-life revenge stories where the ignored, humiliated, and betrayed rise quietly, and make it count. I truly enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and hearing from you directly. One important note: some elements in this story have been fictionalized for educational and storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or settings is coincidental. That being said, the message I'm sharing is meaningful, and I hope it speaks to you. Let me tell you who I was before my world went black, because none of what comes after makes sense without it. My name is Elise Ashford. I was 22 years old when the accident happened, a mechanical engineering student in my junior year, with a minor in applied mathematics and a drawer full of perfect grades that nobody in my family ever quite celebrated the way they celebrated Naomi's art school acceptance. I had Grandpa Harold's hands. Long-fingered, precise, patient. The kind of hands that could feel a flaw in a gear tooth the way a musician hears a note slightly off-key. The Ashfords had been clockmakers for 6 generations. Our ancestor, Thomas Ashford, had crafted timepieces for the courts of Europe. 2 of them still ticked under glass in the Antiquarian Horology Museum in London. The craft had thinned over the years, diluted by comfort and obligation, until it reached my parents. Competent custodians who ran the shop like a duty, not a devotion. But Grandpa Harold still had the fire. And he passed it, burning, directly into me. I loved what lived inside clocks, the invisible logic, the mathematics made metal, the way every gear existed in relationship to every other. Naomi loved their faces, their beauty. We were different and equal, and Grandpa said so constantly. Until everything changed on a Thursday evening in March. Grandpa Harold's workshop was the truest place I have ever known. It sat behind the main shop like a secret, a long, low-ceilinged room dense with the overlapping voices of hundreds of clocks. You didn't just hear them in there. You felt them in your sternum, in the soft tissue of your inner wrists. The room breathed in ticks and exhaled in chimes. Naomi and I grew up in that room. While other children played outside, we sat on tall wooden stools at Grandpa's workbench, watching his hands move over tiny brass components with a surgeon's confidence. He smelled like machine oil and cedar and old tea. He called us his 2 apprentices. He never made us feel like we were tolerated. He made us feel necessary. He taught me to diagnose a clock's problem by sound alone. A subtle drag in the escapement, a spring wound too tight, the microscopic catch of a gear tooth that had developed a burr. I would close my eyes and listen and name the fault, and Grandpa would laugh with the particular joy of a man watching his legacy take root. "You hear time itself," he'd tell me, pressing my hand over a running movement so I could feel its heartbeat. "That is not a skill. That is a gift." He taught Naomi the artistry of cases, the language of form and ornamentation. He told us, always, that we were 2 halves of one whole. Separately skilled. Together unstoppable. I believed him. I held that belief like a compass. Right up until the moment it was taken from me. Grandpa Harold died in October. The same month the maples turned red and the workshop filled with a particular quality of afternoon light that I have never seen replicated anywhere else in the world. He died in his own bed, surrounded by the sound of clocks he had wound himself that morning because he said he wanted them all running when he left. 2 days before he passed, he called Naomi and me to his bedside separately. He spoke to Naomi first, and she came out red-eyed and clutching a folded piece of paper. He called me in next. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were still lit with that specific brightness that belonged only to him. The light of a man who spent his entire life doing exactly what he loved. "I started something," he whispered, his fingers finding mine on the bedspread. "The greatest clock I ever imagined. The plans are finished. The parts are ordered. But I ran out of time, Elise." He almost smiled at that. "You and your sister will finish it. Together. Promise me." "I promise," I said. The words came easily because I had never broken a promise to him. 2 weeks after the funeral, I found the blueprints in his workshop, a clock of incomprehensible complexity, with a moon phase display accurate to 10,000 years. Naomi found the case sketches tucked inside. Flowing bronze lines, crystal panels, Art Nouveau details that looked like time itself had been captured in metal. "After college," we agreed. "When we know enough." We had no idea what was coming. The rain started slowly that Thursday evening. Fat, deliberate drops that made the windshield wipers beat like a metronome. I remember that detail precisely. The rhythm of it, the mechanical regularity, the way it almost lulled me into comfort on those winding country roads. I don't remember the deer. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember the sound of glass or the sensation of rolling or the silence that must have followed. The brain, I later learned, sometimes edits its own worst moments. What I remember is a heart monitor. Its electronic beep was the first thing that returned to me. A flat, modern sound with no warmth in it, nothing like the organic rhythms I had spent my whole life loving. I remember the heaviness of bandages around my eyes. I remember a doctor's voice, careful and kind, explaining that the damage to my optic nerves was permanent and total. "Completely blind," he said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I lay there in the dark that was now my only dark and thought about Grandpa Harold. I thought about his hands guiding mine over a running movement, telling me I could feel time itself. I thought about the blueprints for his unfinished masterpiece. I thought about the promise I had made. Then I thought, I can still keep it. Can still do this. I had no idea my family was already making different plans. They waited exactly 12 days after I came home from the hospital. 12 days. I know because I counted them in the ticks of the mantel clock on the hallway shelf, the one I had repaired myself at age 16. I navigated by its voice in those early disorienting days of new blindness, using its sound as a landmark the way sailors once used stars. The meeting happened at the kitchen table. My mother presented it as a family discussion. In truth, it was a sentencing. "Be realistic, Elise," my father said. His voice was not unkind. That almost made it worse. "Clockmaking requires fine detail work. Precision work. You can't see the components. I don't need to see them. Can feel them. I've always worked more by touch than sight. Grandpa taught me. Grandpa isn't here." My mother's voice was quiet. Final. Navigation called from art school. Her voice rising and breaking over the phone speaker as she argued for me. "She can do it. We work together. She handles mechanisms, I handle the visual design." That was always the plan. That was Grandpa's plan. But they were already decided. They had researched Cloverfield Assisted Living. They had spoken to the director. There was a room available. "It's temporary," they said. "Until you adjust." I sat at that table and felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger. Anger is hot and dissolves quickly. This was colder. More permanent. More patient. I decided I would show them all exactly who I was. Cloverfield Assisted Living smelled like disinfectant layered over synthetic lavender, a combination so aggressively cheerful it felt like an insult. My room was a smooth-walled box. One bed, one dresser, one window my aide told me faced the parking lot. The walls were painted in colors I would never see and decorated with prints I would never know. The silence was the thing I was least prepared for. Not literal silence. There was always the hum of fluorescent lighting, the shuffle of soft-soled shoes, the distant television murmuring in the common room. But there was no ticking, no mechanical heartbeat, no symphony of overlapping time signatures that had been the soundtrack of my entire life. I withdrew completely those first weeks, stayed in bed longer than I should have, pushed meals away. A therapist visited twice a week and asked careful questions I answered as briefly as possible. I was not angry at her. I was not angry at anyone. I was simply hollow, scraped out by loss and left with a shell of myself that didn't know what to do without its purpose. Naomi called every few days at first, then once a week, then less. Her voice on the phone was strained with guilt and helplessness. My parents' voices were careful, monitored. They were waiting for me to accept my new reality. I was waiting for something else entirely. I just didn't know what form it would take yet. It found me on a Tuesday 3 weeks into my stay at Cloverfield. I was moving along the hallway wall with my fingertips, practicing the navigation routes I had been given by the mobility specialist, a practical woman who spoke in precise, encouraging sentences I respected. I was counting door frames when I heard it. Clock. Ticking in the corridor. I stopped moving. I stopped breathing almost. The sound was coming from above and to my left. An old institutional wall clock, probably mid-century manufacture, with a plastic casing I could only imagine. But the movement inside was mechanical and real and honest, and its tick cut through Cloverfield's oppressive ambient noise like a single clear note through static. I stood beneath it for a long time. Then I found a chair and pulled it beneath the clock and sat there for what must have been 2 hours, just listening. The staff gave me a wide berth. Someone brought me tea I didn't drink. But I was not wasting time. I was working. I was listening to the escapement. And there, every 7th beat I heard it. A microscopic irregularity. Not a fault, a characteristic. The anchor had developed a consistent, harmless eccentricity that gave the clock a personality, a fingerprint. The timekeeping remained perfect because the irregularity never varied. For the first time since the accident, I felt like myself again. And sitting there beneath that ordinary clock in that ordinary hallway, I understood. The dark had taken my sight. But it had not touched my gift. Her name was Ruth Okafor, and she was 63 years old, a retired secondary school teacher who volunteered at Cloverfield 3 mornings a week to help residents write letters and navigate paperwork. She had a voice like warm wood, unhurried, resonant, carrying the particular authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult things accessible to reluctant minds. She noticed me under the clock first on a Wednesday. "You know about that old thing?" she asked, setting a paper cup of coffee on the small table beside me. "I know everything about it," I said. "The escapement has a slight wear pattern on the 7th tooth of the anchor wheel. It started probably 8 years ago and has been consistent since. The movement is original to the case. You can hear that the mainspring is the factory gauge because of the particular decay curve in its strike." Silence. Then, "You're a clockmaker." I was. Ruth didn't argue with the past tense that day. She let it sit. But the following week, she arrived with a small paper bag from the hobby shop downtown. A basic clock movement kit meant for children, with large plastic gears and a simple quartz mechanism. "I know it's not what you're used to," she said carefully. "But I thought maybe." I took the bag out of her hands before she finished the sentence. My fingers found the familiar weight of components. My heart rate changed the way it always had in Grandpa Harold's workshop. Slower, deeper, focused. Whatever had been sleeping inside me opened one eye. I had no idea yet what Ruth would cost me later. But that morning she gave me back my life. My first attempt was a disaster that took 3 hours and ended with clock components scattered across my bed and me sitting in the middle of them, shaking with frustration and something I refused to let become despair. Ruth found me that way. She did not offer comfort immediately, which I respected. She pulled up a chair and waited. "I can't orient the movement," I said finally. "Without visual reference, I can't tell which way is up. How would you tell if your eyes were closed?" I thought about that for a long moment. Then I picked up the movement housing and ran my thumbnail along its edges. There was a slight chamfer on the top edge, a design feature for aesthetics that became, in that moment, a compass point. That was the beginning. Over the following weeks, I built an entirely new way of working. I learned that brass components rang warm and mellow when tapped against wood. Steel rang sharper, higher. I learned to count gear teeth by rolling them between my index finger and thumb, to read spring tension by compression resistance, to hear when a pivoting arbor was set at correct depth by the change in sound when I pressed lightly on its tip. I built a system of ice cube trays, each section holding a category of component. I marked every tool handle with a textured tape code I designed myself. I learned the weight of every mainspring gauge by memory. I was not compensating for what I had lost. I was building something new. Something that had never existed before me. And I began to understand, extraordinary. It happened on a Friday evening in November, with rain against my single window and the hallway clock marking 8 o'clock with its plain, reliable chime. I had been working on a simple alarm clock movement for 4 hours. My fingertips were sore from the precision of it, the repeated testing and adjusting, the miniature tools that demanded stillness I hadn't known I could summon in those early months of blindness. Every previous attempt had produced a movement that either refused to run or stopped after a few minutes, binding up at some point of invisible imprecision. This time I installed the final component, the click spring, seated in its recess with a friction fit I had calibrated entirely by feel, and wound the mainspring 3 careful turns. My thumb found the start lever. I released it. The tick that answered me was clean, steady, strong. It had the particular quality of a perfect mechanical movement. Not just consistent but alive, purposeful, a sound that carried the confidence of everything inside it working in exact relationship. I held that simple movement against my ear and listened to it beat for a long time. I was crying before I understood that I was crying. Slow tears that I didn't bother to wipe away because my hands were occupied with something more important. I was still a clockmaker. I had always been a clockmaker. The darkness had changed the method. It had not changed the gift. I set the movement down carefully, memorized its position on the tray, and decided it was time to start thinking about Geneva. I didn't know Ruth had been filming. I found out the way I found out most things at Cloverfield, through overheard conversation. An aide mentioned it to another aide in the corridor. "You see that video of the blind clockmaker? It's got 2 million views." My hand went still on the movement I was calibrating. 2 million. Ruth appeared at my door that afternoon with her characteristic lack of preamble. "I should have asked," she said. "I'm sorry. I can take it down if you want." I considered that for a moment. The truth was, I wasn't angry. I understood why she'd done it. She had watched me work for 3 months and seen something worth sharing. I couldn't fault her for that impulse. "What are people saying?" I asked. She read me comments for 40 minutes. Clockmaking forums. Collectors. Horological societies in 7 countries. A woman in Osaka who had lost her vision at 30 and said watching my video was the first time she had cried with hope instead of grief. A master watchmaker in Geneva who said my tactile measurement technique was the most innovative approach he had seen in 20 years. And then Ruth read me an email. It was from the International Horology Exhibition in Vienna, one of the oldest and most prestigious clockmaking competitions in the world. "Dear Ms. Ashford," she began, "we would like to formally invite you to participate in this year's masterpiece of the Next Generation competition." I sat very still. Outside, the November rain kept falling. I already knew what I was going to build. I requested Grandpa Harold's blueprints through my mother, who shipped them without comment in a cardboard tube that arrived smelling faintly of the workshop, machine oil and cedar and something indefinable that was simply Harold. Ruth helped me scan them and print them at enormous scale. Then, over the course of 2 weeks, I created a tactile version. Raised lines traced in dimensional paint, braille labels marking every component, every gear ratio, every spring specification. I mapped Harold's vision with my fingertips until I could navigate the entire design from memory. The complexity was staggering even by the standards of the master clockmakers I had studied. Multiple complications running simultaneously. A perpetual calendar that would correct itself through February of leap years. A moon phase display accurate for millennia. An equation of time cam that showed the difference between clock time and true solar time. A chime mechanism that would play a melody Harold had composed himself. Different arrangements for each hour of the day. I contacted a precision fabricator in the city, a former aerospace machinist named Daniel who had turned to horological components in retirement. I explained what I needed. He was quiet for a long moment. "These tolerances are extraordinary," he said. 1/1000th of an inch on the escapement wheel teeth. "Can you do it?" Another pause. "Yes. But this will take months." "I have months," I said. What I didn't have, what I hadn't yet admitted to myself that I needed, was a case. I needed Naomi. And Naomi had stopped returning my calls 6 weeks ago. I want to be fair to Naomi, even now. She was 22 and 300 miles away, and living under the sustained weight of our parents' framing of events. They had a particular gift, my parents, for presenting their decisions as consensus, for describing their choices as though everyone had agreed, including people who hadn't been consulted. But that winter I couldn't afford fairness. I could only document facts. Fact. Naomi had called me every week for the first 2 months after Cloverfield. Her voice had been warm and anguished, full of promises to fight for me, to convince our parents to find another way. Fact. The calls had grown shorter, then less frequent, then stopped entirely. Fact. When I called the workshop number, it was Naomi who answered now, in the voice of someone who had settled into a role they hadn't asked for but had accepted. Fact. She never answered my personal calls. She never called back. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know what our parents had told her, what particular version of events they had constructed to explain away my absence and Naomi's guilt. That knowledge would come later, and it would change everything. What I knew that winter was only this. I needed the other half of the masterpiece's creation, and she had gone quiet. So I did the one thing I had always been good at. I prepared, waited, built, and I wrote her a letter that took me 3 days to finish. I wrote it on my Braille keyboard, translating as I went, asking Ruth to check the printed version for errors. I rewrote it 6 times. The first 5 drafts were wrong. Too angry or too pleading, or too carefully neutral in a way that communicated its own kind of accusation. The 6th draft was honest. "Dear Naomi," it began. "I'm building Grandpa's masterpiece. I'm in Cloverfield, yes, but I want you to understand what that means now. It means I have a workshop table beside my bed, and a precision fabricator making custom components from Harold specifications, and 4 months of the most technically demanding clockmaking I have ever done. I want you to understand that I am not broken. I am, in fact, becoming something neither of us expected." I told her about the movement, about the viral video, about the Vienna invitation, about Ruth and Daniel and the tactile mapping of Harold's blueprints. I told her about the night I heard the first perfect tick of a movement I had assembled in complete darkness and understood that my gift had not left me. It had only changed its method. Then I told her the truth she needed to hear. The movement will be done in 6 weeks. But the case, the beautiful, impossible case Harold designed, I cannot build that. You know I can't. You're the only person in the world who can. I ended it. I'm not asking you to forgive me for whatever you think I've done. I'm asking you to keep the promise we made to Grandpa. That's all. I sent it on a Thursday. Waited. The clock in the hallway counted the seconds. While I waited for Naomi to respond, the masterpiece grew. Daniel delivered the first batch of custom components in January, a small cardboard box that arrived by courier, each component wrapped in tissue paper and nested in foam. I unwrapped them at my workbench with the reverence of someone opening a reliquary. The gear train was perfect. I could feel the exactness in the tooth pitch, the mirror smoothness of the pivot surfaces, the precise depth of the crossing cuts. Daniel had understood Harold's vision with the instinct of a craftsman who had spent 40 years reading specifications as poetry. The movement took shape over 8 weeks. It was the most complex thing I had ever built. Multiple gear trains interacting, each with its own logic, each dependent on every other. I worked in 4-hour sessions, resting when my fingers began to lose sensitivity. I listened to each subassembly as I completed it, learning its voice, understanding how it would speak within the larger conversation of the whole. The chime mechanism was the last to go in. 18 months, 12 bells. Harold's melody distributed across them in a pattern I had memorized from the Braille score Ruth helped me transcribe. When I installed the final hammer and tested the sequence manually, finger by finger, a note at a time, feeling the hammers fall, I heard the melody Harold had composed. I heard it with my hands. I sat at my workbench for a long time after that, just breathing. The movement was done. 6,000 parts. Not one of them placed by eyes that could see. And then Ruth knocked on my door, her voice strange. "Elise, you have a visitor." I knew her footsteps before she reached my door. I had known Naomi's footsteps my entire life. The particular rhythm of her, the slight hesitation in the left foot she'd had since childhood when she twisted her ankle at 12. She stopped in the doorway, and I could feel her taking in the room. The organized trays, the workbench, the felt-lined surface where the completed movement sat under a lens cloth I had placed over it like a veil. "Hi," she said. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. "Hi," I said. The silence between us held 2 years of distance and hurt and guilt and things we hadn't said to each other. I let it breathe. I had learned patience in ways that had cost me more than either of us would ever be comfortable acknowledging. Then she crossed the room and lifted the lens cloth. I heard her sharp intake of breath, a sound I recognized. She made it when something moved her beyond her capacity for words. "Elise," she said, barely audible. "This is..." "Wind it," I said. She turned the key. The movement came alive around us. Not the simple honest tick of that first alarm clock in November, but something vast and layered. Every complication spoke simultaneously. The perpetual calendar advanced with a precise click. The equation cam turned a fraction of a degree. And then the chimes began Harold's melody, every note falling clean and exact. Navigation was crying before the first phrase finished. "He would be so proud," she whispered. "He will be," I said, "when it's finished." Pause. "Did you bring the sketches?" She laughed, a wet, exhausted, relieved sound. "I brought more than sketches." We worked through that first evening side by side, Naomi spreading her drawings across every flat surface, describing each element to me with a precision I hadn't expected. She had grown, I realized. The 2 years had changed her too, though differently. She spoke about form and material with a technical confidence she hadn't had before. It was after midnight, in the quiet that follows exhausted honesty, that she told me. "I need you to know something," she said. Her voice had changed register, lower, braced against something. "I need you to know why I stopped calling." Waited. "They told me you'd asked them to arrange Cloverfield. That you had decided on your own, that you needed professional care and that you wanted space from the workshop and from all of it." Her voice cracked. "They said you specifically asked that I not visit because it was making the transition harder. That you needed to grieve what you'd lost and my presence was." She stopped. The clock in the hallway marked 1 in the morning. "I never said any of that," I said quietly. "I know," she said. "I should have called you directly. I should have trusted." "Yes." Kept my voice steady. This was not the moment for anger. This was the moment for truth. "They told you a story that made your guilt manageable and kept me isolated. They did that deliberately, Naomi." Another long silence. "What do we do?" she asked. "We finish the clock," I said. "Then we let them watch what happens next." We worked for 36 hours with breaks only for sleep and food that Ruth brought on a tray with the brisk competence of someone who understood that great work required fuel and nothing else. Navigation's case design had evolved beyond Harold's original sketches. She had honored his vision, The Art Nouveau flow of the lines, the bronze casting, the crystal panels angled to reveal the movement's interior like a stage. But she had added something of her own. Clean contemporary intervals between the ornamentation, modern restraint that made the historical elements breathe rather than crowd each other. It was, she explained as she described it, a conversation between the generation that began the dream and the generation that completed it. I handled the movement's integration into the case. The precise alignment of the winding arbors with their corresponding holes in the dial plate, the tensioning of the chime hammers relative to the bell's position, the adjustment of the pendulum's effective length to match the new case's acoustic properties. Every calculation done by touch, by sound, by the muscle memory of 1,000 hours of practice. At some point during the second night, our hands crossed on the workbench. Neither of us moved away. Grandpa said we were two halves, Naomi said. He was right, I said. He usually was. At 4 a.m. on the second day, I wound the masterpiece for the first time in its completed form. The chimes rang through Cloverfield's quiet corridors. Harold's melody, clear and complex, 12 notes that climbed and descended with the mathematical elegance of something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Somewhere down the hall, a light came on. Someone was listening. The competition was in 3 weeks. Naomi had arranged transportation. She did not tell our parents about Vienna until the arrangements were made, a small, deliberate choice that I noticed and appreciated. My mother called the day after Naomi's visit. I could tell from the quality of her pauses that she had expected a different outcome, that Naomi's visit would confirm what they had told her, that she would come away saddened by what I had become and relieved that the workshop decision had been the right one. Naomi says you're entering a competition, my mother said. The International Horology Exhibition in Vienna. Yes. Elise. Her voice carried that specific texture, the gentle certainty of someone who believes they are being kind when they are actually being limiting. I think this is wonderful that you've found a hobby. But representing the family in a professional competition. I'm not representing the family, I said. I'm entering as Elise Ashford, clockmaker, with a movement I built myself and a case my sister designed. What we do there reflects on us, not on decisions that were made on our behalf. A pause long enough to contain several things she chose not to say. We'll be there, she said finally. Your father and I want to support. You're welcome to attend, I said. It's open to the public. I ended the call. My hands were steady on the workbench surface. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to prepare. I picked up a small file and got back to work. Vienna in April smells like rain and stone and flowers that have only just decided to open. I know this not from seeing it but from the particular quality of air when Naomi led me through the exhibition hall entrance. Cool and old, layered with wood polish and the faint mineral breath of buildings that have been holding knowledge for centuries. The hall was vast. I could tell from the acoustic properties, the way sound traveled and returned, the sense of ceiling height in the way echoes behaved. Naomi described it quietly as we walked. Galleries lined with glass cases, clockmakers from 19 countries, timepieces representing every tradition from Japanese maki lacquer cases to Swiss ultra-thin movements to a German astronomical clock that stood 8 feet tall and tracked the movements of 5 planets. Our clock sat at the center of the main exhibition floor, under the velvet cover Naomi had chosen. Deep green, the color of Harold's old workshop apron. I could hear the crowd moving around it. I could hear people stopping, the change in footstep patterns that meant something had caught their attention. The case, Naomi whispered, was drawing interest before the competition even officially opened. A collector from Amsterdam had already asked who the maker was. A journalist from a horological trade publication had stopped and photographed it for 20 minutes. I stood beside it with my hand resting lightly on the cover and listened to the room around me. I had spent 2 years learning to read the world through sound. What I heard in that room sounded very much like the beginning of something. The head judge was a woman named Professor Liesel Brenner, a master horologist from the University of Vienna whose reputation was, Naomi whispered, the kind that made experienced craftsmen nervous. She moved through the exhibition in silence, spending between 3 and 15 minutes at each entry, asking precise technical questions in German-accented English that required precise technical answers. She stopped at our clock for 28 minutes. I know because I counted. She asked me directly about the escapement geometry. I answered directly. She asked about the equation of time cam's design, how the follower profile had been calculated. Answered. She asked how the moon phase display had been calibrated for its 10,000-year accuracy claim. I told her the mathematics. Then she said very quietly, "Ms. Ashford, are you aware that your pivot polishing on the third wheel of the going train is finer than anything produced by any commercial workshop I have examined in the last decade?" "Yes," I said. "When you can't see the surface, you listen to the friction instead. You hear every imperfection. The standard gets higher." Silence. "I see." Another pause. "The movement was assembled entirely without sight." Entirely. I heard her write something on her clipboard. A long sentence. My parents were somewhere in the crowd behind me. I had known they were there since I heard my mother's particular cough, the one she gave when she was trying not to show emotion. I wondered what she was thinking, standing in that hall, watching a judge treat her blind daughter like a master. I did not turn around to check. The announcement came at 6 in the evening. In a hall that had gone so quiet I could hear the intake of breath from the audience as Professor Brenner took the podium. She spoke first about the history of the exhibition, about the tradition it represented, about the responsibility of honoring craft while embracing innovation. She spoke about what the judges had seen over 2 days of evaluation. Levels of skill, approaches to complexity, the ongoing conversation between horological tradition and modern technique. Then she paused in a way that made the room hold its breath. "This year's masterpiece of the next generation," she said, "represents something this competition has never before seen in its 47-year history. It represents the unification of two extraordinary talents in service of a vision that spans multiple generations. It represents technical innovation that redefines the limits of what precision craftsmanship means, demonstrated by a maker who proves that the highest standards are achieved not by sight but by devotion." Navigation's hand found mine. The award goes to Elise and Naomi Ashford for Harold's masterpiece, a timepiece of incomparable technical achievement and profound artistic beauty, built in fulfillment of a promise made to their late grandfather, presented to the world by two women who refused to be told what they were capable of. The applause began somewhere to my left and grew until I could feel it in my sternum. Navigation was crying. I was not. My face was completely still. I was listening to the clock, our clock, chiming 6 in the evening. Harold's melody rolling out across the crowded hall in its perfect patient voice. We had kept the promise. The crowd moved toward us after the announcement like a warm tide. Journalists, collectors, fellow competitors who shook my hand with a particular grip of professionals who recognize their equal. Professor Brenner told me quietly that she would be writing about my tactile assembly technique in the next volume of the European Journal of Horology. And then I heard my mother's footsteps. I know them the way I know all footsteps that have been part of my life. By their rhythm, their hesitation, the specific sound of the shoes she always wore to formal occasions. She had brought my father. They stopped a foot away. "Elise," my mother said. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Not pride exactly. Something more complicated. Something like reckoning. "Congratulations," my father said. The word came out stiffly, like something he had practiced and still hadn't mastered. I turned toward them. I did not smile warmly or weep with relief or say the things I had sometimes imagined saying in the dark quiet of my room at Cloverfield. I had spent too long on the other side of their certainty to perform gratitude for their presence. "Thank you for coming," I said. That was all. Then Naomi stepped beside me and took my arm, and we turned together toward Professor Brenner and the cluster of journalists and the collector from Amsterdam who wanted to discuss the clock's acquisition price. Behind us, my parents stood in the hall that now contained the evidence of everything they had been wrong about. I did not look back. I didn't need to. The clock sold for a sum I still find difficult to say aloud. The collector from Amsterdam, a man who had spent 40 years assembling one of the finest private horological collections in the world, told Naomi that Harold's masterpiece was the finest contemporary timepiece he had ever acquired. He said he intended to display it with a placard that named both of us and described how it was built. That placard, he told me, would also note that the movement was assembled entirely without sight. Naomi and I flew home on a Friday morning. The workshop was waiting. The real one, Harold's workshop, with its dust motes and its symphony of overlapping voices and its smell of machine oil and cedar. My parents met us there. No one knew quite what to say, so we said very little. But my mother placed the workshop key in my hand. Not Naomi's hand, mine, and she held it there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I did not make a speech. I did not list their failures or catalogue the cost of their decisions. I simply closed my fingers around the key and felt its weight and said thank you, meaning it in the limited way that truth allows. That evening, Naomi and I sat at Grandpa Harold's workbench while the clocks ticked around us in their overlapping, breathing rhythms. We were planning the next one already. Drawing on felt surface boards, tracing raised lines, translating beauty and precision into a language our combined hands could build. They said I'd never craft again, I said quietly. They were wrong, Naomi said. Yes. I set my tools down and listened to the room, the warm, living, mechanical room that had always been mine. They were measuring me by what they could see. They forgot that the things worth building are the things you feel. Outside, the evening moved forward 1 second at a time, quiet and inexorable. Time does not hurry for the impatient or slow for the grieving. It simply continues. Steady, precise, indifferent to doubt. And in that indifference, I had found my freedom. Picked up my tools. I got back to work. If this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel for more true stories like this one. Leave a comment below, telling me what you would have done in my situation. I read every single one. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your share might save someone's life. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I know this wasn't an easy story to hear, and I want to be honest with you, some of the stories that follow contain fictionalized elements created for educational purposes. If that's not something you're comfortable with, feel free to explore other content that suits you better. But if you're willing to learn from real experiences, even painful ones, I'll be here sharing what I've learned. God bless you. And remember, protecting what is yours should never be an option.